PFMC staff. I think we should get started with this webinar. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars that are sort of the kickoff of the newest initiative under our fishery ecosystem plan, which is an initiative to look at the effects of climate change and variability, and with a focus on effects on fishing communities. And today's presentation, the first one, as you can see on the screen, I think, is the question, what do we expect to happen in California, in the California current under climate change? Just a few notes before I turn the screen over to the presenters. First off, as noted there, we have muted the participants. I have unmuted the members of the ecosystem work group, but other folks are muted for the time being. Obviously, we'll have the presenters unmuted. And then at the once the presentation is over, we'll have a chance for some question and answer, any comments. And if you're muted, if you're not a member of the work group, you can use the hand raise feature in GoToMeeting, and you click on that, and we'll see a raised hand, and that'll be a signal to us to unmute you and give you a chance to ask a question or make a comment. Just a few other notes. There's a phone number there. If you're having technical problems, obviously, if you're having technical problems, you can't hear or see this, so I don't know. But in any case, you can call Sandra and she can help. We will be recording this presentation, and we intend to make the recording available on our website at some point, not too long after each webinar is completed. So that's about it for my introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll turn the screen over to Michael Jacox. He's the one who has the slides on his computer, and we'll take it from there.
All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes. Oh, we can see it.
All right. And now in full screen? Okay.
No, it's showing the notes page rather than the full screen.
Oh, okay.
If you switch monitors.
How about now? Is it full screen now, or is it still on presenter notes?
It's still on presenter notes. You may need to, I think there's a way to control that within the presentation software within PowerPoint.
Yeah. How about now?
Hey!
Okay, great. All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Mike Jacox, and put this talk together with Nate Mantua and Stephen Bograd, and Nate's going to actually present the latter part of the talk, and Stephen is on hand here to help field any questions. But basically, we want to give an overview of what we expect to happen under climate change, and part of that is sort of projecting out trends, and part of it is thinking about, given the uncertainty in what will happen, how do we best deal with that? So just a brief outline here. Okay, so first I'm going to talk basically about what the anticipated climate change signal will be in the California current system. After that, moving to some recent anomalies, which are sort of useful in guiding how we think about climate change, and then finally, what some of the challenges these things present to fisheries management. So in order to think about projecting climate change and impacts on the California current system, it's good to think about what are the important parameters or dynamics that operate in the California current system. And this schematic does a pretty nice job of showing that. I'll sort of walk you through. There's a purple arrow there, which is wind. And so in the spring and summer, especially in some places year-round, we get these winds blowing from the north to the south along the coast. And that wind, combined with the rotation of the Earth, actually causes water in the surface of the ocean to move offshore. And when that water moves offshore in the surface, it gets replaced by deep water, and this is this blue arrow. And that's a process called upwelling. And it's kind of a fundamental driver of what we see in the California current system. So when this deep cold water comes up to the surface, it brings with it nutrients, which are more abundant at depth than they are at the surface. And when those nutrients come up and combine with the availability of sunlight, that enables these microscopic phytoplankton that are in the little inset circle there to grow. And they form the base of the marine food web. And so they get fed on by zooplankton that are slightly larger and fish, and all the way up into top predators and the largest marine mammals in the sea. So that's kind of a schematic, but we can also see it in data. So now you're looking at a map of the global sort of mean concentration of chlorophyll, which is a pigment that these phytoplankton have in them. So you can think about this as the concentration basically of those phytoplankton that are the base of the food web. And I've put boxes around 4 regions which are major upwelling systems, one of them being the California current system. And so you can see these greens and reds, these regions jump out as these highly productive systems. And so that supports these higher trophic levels, and that we can actually see directly too with data like the ones that are summarized here. And what you're looking at now in these different colored tracks these are animals that have been tagged, actually have tags put on them, and so their movements can be tracked. And you can see that some of them travel all over the North and even South Pacific, but the California current system is this region that seasonally for some animals and year-round for others, they rely on as this real resource, a food resource. So those physical processes, translate up through the food web. Okay, so clearly upwelling is something that we want to think about what might happen under climate change. And the first hypothesis about what would happen was a fairly simple idea that was put forth in 1990 by Andy Bakken. The idea was basically that the H and L there are 2 pressure systems in the atmosphere, a high pressure system and a low pressure system. And the difference between them is what forces these winds that go down along the coast, that gray arrow. And he hypothesized that under global warming, that low pressure system over the land would intensify and that gradient would increase. So the winds would get stronger. So it was this upwelling intensification hypothesis. And there have been some observational studies looking at available data over the past 50 years or so. And this is a figure from one where it's basically showing whether there is a trend whether there has been a trend over the recent decades in upwelling on the y-axis there, so higher values are more indicative of a positive trend in upwelling. And along the x-axis is the latitude. So this is basically showing that as you go to higher latitudes, it seems more likely that there's been this observed trend. And I'll get into this more, but this hypothesis is, we've found now to be probably oversimplified, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but it's kind of the idea, one of the ideas that we're thinking about. And along with it, we're thinking about other things like, as upwelling changes, how do things change like stratification, which is, stratification is a measure of the difference in density from the surface of the water column to deeper, and that impacts how easy it is for deep water to come up. Other things like, will the nutrients in those waters that are being upwelled change, and consequently change the biological activity that they fuel? And other things like, will hypoxia, low oxygen conditions, or ocean acidification, decreased pH, be influenced by climate change? So the main tool that we have to look at these questions at this point is these global climate models. And don't worry about being able to see the details in this figure, but it's just a schematic of how these models work. And in the globe there, you've got a grid that's on the ocean surface and on the land surface. So you've got sort of model and land components of these models, and then the gray grid overlying that is the atmosphere. So you also have a model component for the atmosphere. And then you have all of these equations, basically, that relate different pieces of the system to each other. So between sea ice and the atmosphere and the ocean and the continent, you have, you know, rain and snow, you have evaporation, you have the sun's radiation coming in, and you have long wave radiation that goes back out and interacts with greenhouse gases and can radiate back into the atmosphere, or back to the Earth, sorry. So we've got this model framework, and then what we do is we run it forward in time with some change in the greenhouse gas forcing, basically. And so what you're seeing here is the temperature induced by different changes in greenhouse gases. And these are called RCPs, or relative concentration pathways. And the red one there on the top is the one you hear about the most, probably, RCP 8.5, which may look kind of pessimistic, but it's the closest to what we're actually doing at this point. So hopefully we can maybe go for something less extreme than that, but it's a good scenario to use at this point to evaluate potential impacts. All right, so that's sort of the modeling framework and the tool, and then we can go into those models and see what they say about future changes. So first, looking at coastal upwelling. On the left, you've got a map of the West Coast, basically, and in color, you're seeing the projected changes in upwelling. So yellow and red indicate increased upwelling, which would be what that back-end hypothesis says we should expect. And in blue is actually decreased upwelling. And the sort of dotted stippling there are areas where that change is large enough that it's statistically significant. And so you'll see that this doesn't really agree with that back-end hypothesis. What we actually see is in the north, there's little to maybe a slightly positive change, and south of maybe the California-Oregon border, you actually get decreased upwelling. And you can also see that in these plots to the right, where there what you're seeing is all these colored lines are output from different models. And the thick black lines are the mean of all those models. So in that northward portion, you see almost no change in upwelling. And in the more southern portion, you actually see a decrease. And there's actually some nuance to this if you look at it on a seasonal scale, which is important, as I said, that a lot of these animals are sort of impacted by seasonal processes. And this figure is just showing those same changes, but now as a function of the month of the year along the horizontal axis and the latitude along the vertical axis. And just pointing out a couple of things here, that on month 4, April, you get this stronger upwelling. So that's sort of the beginning of the upwelling season. So that might indicate an earlier start of upwelling, maybe a longer upwelling season, where then later in the upwelling season in the late summer, you've got a decrease and you might have weaker upwelling during the peak of the upwelling season. And this is important as studies have shown that different species are more sensitive to different parts of the year in terms of the upwelling. Some are more sensitive to variability in the wintertime upwelling, and some are more sensitive to variability in the summertime upwelling. So that's kind of the story of the projections for upwelling itself. Moving on to some other variables of interest. This is the sea surface temperature. On the left is a map of the entire North Pacific. And this is the change from the latter half of the 20th century to the latter half of the 21st century. So basically a 100-year change. And I will say, just before I forget, that these kinds of figures are available. I don't have the reference on here, but there is NOAA has a web portal, a climate change web portal, where you can really easily make these kind of figures and explore the data yourself. And I'm happy to send that information out to whoever should distribute it. So on the left is a mean change, and then on the right is a time series of the change. And you can see that there's sort of this increasing trend, but also a lot of variability. And what the gray indicates is the spread of all these different models. So in order to try to capture the uncertainty in the models, we run many different models, and we run each of them many times. So that dark gray captures 50% of the model projections, and all the way out to the lighter gray captures all of the projections. So on very short time scales, and I'll talk about this more, the change or the difference between models, sort of that uncertainty among models, is actually greater than the forced change, the long-term trend. And as you get out farther and farther away, that trend becomes more significant relative to the variability. So the next slide here is showing the same thing, but for primary productivity. So this is basically the growth of those phytoplankton that provide the energy for the food web. So you've got changes that are positive in some places, negative in some places, but probably more importantly, when you look over to the right, you see that now the uncertainty, the spread between these different model runs is huge. So we've gone from a physical process like upwelling to now this biological process that is dependent on not only upwelling, but other things I mentioned, like the nutrient content of the water and all kinds of things that are represented slightly differently in different models, and so different mechanisms can dominate. So you've got this big spread in the projections that's larger than the trend itself. All right, just showing a couple other variables here. These are maps for oxygen on the top and pH on the bottom, both of which are of interest for a lot of species. Hypoxia along the California or along the U.S. West Coast has become increasingly a concern, especially for species that can't move out of environments like along the ocean bottom when oxygen is low. And pH, decreased pH, increased acidification is a problem, especially for things like shellfish that form shells, and that's harder to do, and shells dissolve as the water gets more acidic. And so now, just for a single climate model, we've got long-term projections for both of those things, basically seeing, starting about now or a few decades ago for pH, big decreases that we expect to continue. The pH is one of the more robust signals, and it's pretty straightforward. As you pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the ocean will take it up and the pH will drop. There's not a whole lot of uncertainty in that. The uncertainty is more in what the human contribution to that will be. So that was just to give an idea of what kind of information we can get out of these climate models in terms of guessing at the long-term trends in some of these important variables. And I want to just say, you know, what the key caveats are in looking at that output. So the first one, I've gotten at a little bit already, but it's these various sources of uncertainty. And they're indicated in 3 different colors here. So the first one is in orange is internal variability. And what that is basically that the atmosphere and the ocean are somewhat chaotic, that there's events like El Niños and things like this that are hard to predict, and they're cyclical. And we get this variability on the scale of years to decades that's really important, but pretty much unpredictable. And so at very short time scale, if you want to predict what's going to happen in 5 years, that internal variability is the dominant source of uncertainty. The next one in blue is model spread. So that's difference between different climate models that represent physics or biology or whatever in different ways. And then finally in green is the spread that you get from these different RCP scenarios. So this is basically just saying, we don't know what the actual greenhouse emissions are going to be moving forward. And the difference between a pessimistic versus an optimistic scenario as we get out to the year 2100 can be huge, which is I don't know, maybe a cause for optimism, right? The green part we have some maybe some control over going towards the lower end of it. So the second caveat for these global climate models is their horizontal resolution. So I showed you that figure showing the grids sort of covering the globe to resolve the atmosphere and the ocean. And these models are hugely computationally expensive to run. It just takes a massive amount of computing power. And the amount of computing power it takes scales with how many grid cells are in those grids, how fine the mesh is on those grids. And so as a result, the current generation of global climate models have resolutions that are typically no better than 1 degree of latitude and longitude, or on the order of 100 kilometers or more. And that's a lot coarser scale than some of the very important processes like upwelling that actually occur in nature along the West Coast. And this figure I'm showing is demonstrative of that. It's a map of upwelling anomaly, so this vertical velocity in the ocean during an El Niño event actually, and how that's represented in a global climate model on the left, and in a high resolution, about 10-kilometer resolution regional ocean model on the right. And basically what you see is that on the right, this has sort of a higher degree of fidelity to nature, and you get this really strong signal that's within 10, 20, maybe 30 kilometers of the coast. In a global climate model, the smallest scale it can resolve is 100 kilometers. So you get this weaker signal that's much more spread out. And so when these dynamics aren't properly resolved, of course, it's an added source of uncertainty in the climate projections. But I will say on that note that next week's webinar at the same time is going to focus specifically on those issues and sort of the state of the art in addressing the limitations of global climate models and how we can do better there. Then the last caveat that I want to mention is just a signal to noise, which is something I hinted at earlier, but basically that when you're thinking about a long-term trend that's forced by anthropogenic change, it can take a long time for the signal of that trend to be greater than that natural variability that happens on shorter time scales. And these maps here basically show a time of emergence, which is how long is it before you can say, yes, this is definitely a long-term trend. It's not just natural variability. And so for something like sea surface temperature, in this analysis, they're finding, on the order of maybe 20 or 30 years for that to emerge, starting, I think, in, 2010 or 2015. Something like primary productivity, where we saw so much more noise in the projections relative to the trend, it can take 50 years or longer for that trend to emerge from the noise. All right, so with that note in mind, I'm going to move on to the next piece, which is talking about the recent years, because I think recent years show us, while some of these trends may take decades to really become super apparent, they still have impacts on shorter timescales. And the way that they have impacts is through extreme events. And the recent few years in the North Pacific are just a not only timely, but a strong example of this. So people are probably aware that there has been some strange activity off the West Coast since about 2013. And this just shows a map of temperature anomalies, so differences of the ocean temperature from what we expect over the last few years. And in the top left corner there was this really, really strong, unprecedented in the observational record, warm anomaly that developed in the Gulf of Alaska and got this nickname, the blob. And then this sort of moved to the east and impacted the entire West Coast. And then in the winter of 2015, or fall winter of 2015, we got this huge El Nino developing. And then since then, we've had a hint of an El Nino in late 2016, and then a stronger, or hint of La Nina, sorry, those cold temperatures that you're seeing along the equator. And then currently a little bit stronger signal like that. So it's been a very extreme period in the North Pacific climate. And it's been widely reported on in not only the scientific community, but in the public sphere. So, here are a few examples of sort of somewhat popular literature, I guess, addressing these things. And another example here of as the blob was already set up, and then we had this El Nino coming, which was termed the Godzilla El Nino. You get cartoons like this one in the LA Times. It says, how are these two climate phenomena going to duke it out in the North Pacific, and what's going to be the impact? The idea at that time, I think, was that El Nino, which typically brings a lot of storms and heavy rainfall, that storm-driven mixing might help to break up the blob a bit in the North Pacific. And so looking at how that actually played out in the North Pacific, there was, with this big El Nino, there was a natural tendency to compare it to past big El Ninos, 82, 83, and 97, 98, being the examples that we have. And it really was pretty different because of this blob, pre-existing blob that was there. And so sort of an illustration of that, these are, again, surface temperature anomalies in the ocean from those three events. And the distinction here is that in 82, 83, and 97, 98, you had this strip of really warm water along the coast. And that's sort of a signature of El Nino. Whereas in 2015, 16, it was just warm everywhere, just this huge scale of warm anomalies that were very persistent and very widespread. And if you look at, the ocean in 3D, you see the same thing on that far right panel there, throughout the water column from the surface down to a couple hundred meters, and sort of all throughout the California current system, you had these warm anomalies. So rather than the El Nino and blob sort of fighting it out, our summary of those conditions was more something like this, which is that the blob was this big dominant thing, and El Nino came in and kind of exacerbated the problems. And, in maybe 2016, they were sort of on their way out, but in their wake is just this ecosystem in disarray. And so this has been termed by some folks a climate stress test. You know, we've had these extremes, and so what do they do to our ecosystem? So another temperature map there with the blob and the Godzilla El Nino and the sort of southern blob, the son of blob, or some call it Cabo Blobo. And just throughout the North Pacific, these sort of wild events and impacts that range from, on the right there, this is a satellite image. Actually, I think it's, well, it's derived from satellite imagery, but it's showing toxic phytoplankton, basically, a harmful algal bloom that we'll talk about more. Sea lions in terrible condition, bird die-offs, and then on bottom left, these are called pelagic red crabs or tuna crabs that are typically off Baja California, and we were seeing them throughout California and even farther north in huge numbers coming up on the beaches. And here's another slide just sort of summarizing some of those impacts, and not all bad necessarily, depending on your viewpoint. You know, there were the sport fishing off Southern California especially, but even farther north was probably the best it's ever been, you know, in terms of some of these tropical species that you wouldn't normally be able to fish appearing in large numbers. But at the same time, there are other species like salmon suffering. There were fishery closures. And again, just species distributions that were wildly different than what we would normally see. And the example of the harmful algal bloom, which actually Nate is going to talk about in more detail, this was an unprecedented impact of these warm anomalies, where this harmful algae just blooms basically across the entire U.S. West Coast and impacted not only crab and fisheries, but marine mammals up and down the West Coast. All right, so then the question is, if an event like this is something that we want to hopefully be able to manage better or deal with under climate change, what is the climate context? What is the climate forcing that drives it? And so we've done some research into this, and largely we can attribute this really warm event to a few different forcing mechanisms. So one is that there was this high pressure system that set up off the West Coast and was very persistent in the winter of 2013 to 14. And what that did was it diverted storms that would normally come through the area around that high pressure ridge. And those storms would normally mix up the ocean and cool it off in the winter. But in the absence of that, we had this really strong heat buildup in the Gulf of Alaska, and there's that blob that you can see in the upper right there. So you have this very warm Gulf of Alaska that later impacted the West Coast. On top of that, you have anomalous winds off the US West Coast, so winds more toward the north than they would normally be, which has the effect through several mechanisms of warming the West Coast. And then lastly, you have one of the strongest El Niños on record develop while all of this is going on. So there's this confluence of, you know, these things, while all unusual, are not necessarily unnatural, but all three of them are coming together in this sort of confluence of forcing to drive warm temperature. So then what is the contribution of anthropogenic forcing? And so this is now another time series showing climate model output, where those different shades of gray sort of capture different percentages of all of the climate models, and the red is the mean of all the climate models. But this is now, instead of looking backward or looking forward, this is looking backward, starting about 1920 up through the present. And the black line is the observed temperature. So you can see that there's a lot of noise in the observed temperature, and that this recent event, that sort of highest spike at 2015, is right at the edge of the envelope of the climate models. And but it doesn't jump out as a huge trend because there's so much noise on the interannual scale. But what we can do with these climate models is we can go in and we can say, how likely is an event like that in different times? And this is what's shown here. So if you look at the figure on the right, and if you just focus really on the green and red curves, what those are showing is for a temperature anomaly along the horizontal axis there, what is the likelihood of it happening on the y-axis? And so if you look at the green, the peak is at 0. So that's basically saying that just in this historical period of 1920 to 1950, the most likely thing is that the temperature is average. The red, then you can see the whole curve has shifted to the right. So the average temperature and the most likely temperature has increased. So then if you look at 2015, it's right here on this plot at a temperature anomaly of 1.7 degrees Celsius. And in the historical, or in the 1920 to 1950 simulations, this is considering something like 30 different models, many runs of each model, so that you're looking at a total on the order of 2,000 simulated years under those conditions. You never see an anomaly that high. And if you run that same experiment now with the greenhouse gases in the current period, you see that an anomaly that high happen, say, 2 to 4% of the time. So even though this trend is not necessarily the dominant thing that jumps out over the variability, the likelihood of hitting that super high value has gone from basically 0 to, well, this is now maybe a 1 in 25 or 50 year event, and will become more likely as we keep on going. So that's sort of the key message there in terms of how I think for this community, the most real impact of climate change in terms of fisheries management is that there's this short-term variability that may be naturally forced, but the long-term trends are going to make extreme and even unprecedented conditions a lot more likely. So moving from the sort of physical piece of that into the challenges it presents for fisheries management, I'm going to hand off to Nate, and I'll keep doing the slides, but if we can, Nate, can you speak? Can we hear you?
Does anyone hear me?
Yes, great.
Good deal. Okay. Yeah, so if we want to understand what does the future hold in terms of climate change impacts on ecosystems and then fisheries management challenges, there's a whole suite of difficult problems tied up in that. There has been a lot of work and a kind of growing body of work addressing different aspects of our changing ocean. Some of that includes laboratory experiments where different organisms are exposed to increasing levels of CO2 in the water or reductions in pH, warming temperatures, declines in dissolved oxygen, all the kind of things that the physical models predict should happen. And you get some sense about which species have more or less sensitivity to changes in these chemical and physical properties of the ocean. And we also have modeling studies that have looked at the distributions of many pelagic species to see what kind of temperature and chlorophyll conditions do we know that these animals stay in, and when we have changes like we experienced in 2015, 16, 17, how do they react to that? So we know that warming the ocean tends to favor range extensions to higher latitudes, contractions of the cold water species at the southern end, and expansion of warm water species at the northern end of their range. But we thought that if you go to the next slide now, Mike, we would give two examples of sort of more complicated types of challenges that are on a lot of people's minds today as being illustrative of the kind of things that are probably coming down the pipe in the near future. And when I say near future, within the next few years, maybe even the next few decades, before we really enter this new ocean that dissolved oxygen changes and warming becomes so extreme that we really have emerged into a totally new system that is nothing like the historical records that we have. And the first example that I'll talk about is this episodic event. You know, I think of it as something new, the 2015-2016 spike in West Coast whale entanglements in fishing gear along the West Coast. There were 71 whales reported to be entangled with gear in 2016. Most of those were humpback whales, and most of that happened in California. The figure at right shows where these were reported, and you could see a hotspot for these entanglements was Monterey Bay and in the Gulf of the Farallones, but it extended all the way up and down the West Coast. And some of these reports may not actually depict where the entanglement happened, but it's where the whale was spotted first with gear on it. And you can see again that most of the colored dots there are in that sort of pink color that indicates that humpback whales were the primary species affected by this record entanglement year. And then the other example that I will talk about is the more chronic issue that's going on with West Coast salmon fisheries. And we know that there's long-term declines and increased frequency of federal fishery disaster declarations, and just the short list there, 1 in the 1980s, 3 in the 1990s, and 5 have been declared in the 2000s, and there are a number of others that are pending right now that may be declared soon. Next slide, please. And this is a time series for West Coast entanglement, whale entanglement reports by species going back to 2000, and just you can see this big jump in 2015, so crossing the 60 line in 2015. 2016 was worse, about 71. 2017 was still elevated, and again, most of the entanglements were with humpback whales. Next slide. So a really unusual year, or series of years going with this period of extreme ocean conditions. And what happened? How did this come about? And I really want to credit Jared Santora, who works here in our lab and also at the University of California, Santa Cruz, for developing this story with other collaborators. He's part of a project with the Ocean Protection Council in California to work with stakeholders to try and understand how this happened and how they can keep it from happening again in the future. But the story that is developing is that there were a number of key ecosystem ingredients related to this persistent marine heat wave that Mike talked about, that really began off California in 2014, peaked in 2015, and lingered into 2016. There was the record harmful algal bloom in 2015. That caused widespread domoic acid contamination in Dungeness crab, and that ended up being a really important factor because it led to a 5-month delay in the opening of Central California's Dungeness crab fishery. At the same time, surveys indicated that there were substantial declines in krill and an increased inshore abundance of anchovy, particularly in Monterey Bay and in the Gulf of the Farallones. And if you look at the maps at the right, it shows May, June, young of the year anchovy catches from a midwell trawl survey that is done here in the Southwest Center. The blue dots indicating very low catches, the yellows and greens and reds indicating higher catches. And you could see in 2013 and 2014, very few YOY anchovy being caught in this region, more in 2015, and then even greater concentrations up on the shelf in 2016. This came into the story because humpback whales, and this is part of Jared's hypothesis, prey switched from targeting krill on the shelf break and along the slope where they typically are at the head of canyons, to a lot more activity on the shelf where the anchovy were now more abundant and available. And that put them in an unusual overlapping situation with the crab gear because of the delayed opening of the crab season. And there were just a lot more people and a lot more gear out for the crab fishery in the spring and early summer of 2015, 16 than you typically, 2016, than you typically see in a more normal year. So next slide, please. And with the West Coast salmon fishery, the picture here shows a history of the Chinook salmon catch in terms of fish landed by thousands. So you can see back in the late 70s into the early 80s, about 1 million fish landed was typical. You get into the 80s, you start to see some of that variability, that big dip in 1983, 84, 85. Was associated with a very warm period along the West Coast that was linked with the 1982-83 El Nino, and then a big spike in the late 80s. And then after that time, lower catches on average, a big trend to lower levels, and including a couple of years in 2008, 2009, where almost no Chinook were landed in the commercial fishery because of extensive closures. So we have this downward trend that is now playing out over the last 40 years, and a lot of variability, plus some extremely poor years, almost no fishing years, which were just simply not part of the historical record, going back to the early part of the 20th century when this fishery really developed. Next slide. And a lot of things have contributed to that downward slide. And one of those issues is developments in the policy world, that the 1989 ESA listing of Sacramento winter run Chinook was the first ESA listing for salmon on the West Coast, but that was followed by many more. And you can see that the 1990s, many different stock groups or ESUs made it onto the endangered species list for both Chinook and coho salmon. And that contributed to a new era of weak stock management, where the mixed stock fisheries along the West Coast now have to consider what the impacts are on weak stocks that need to be protected, and they're being targeted for rebuilding and recovery. So this starts to put more and more constraints on the fishery if one of these weak stocks that's out with other populations that aren't in so bad shape can be impacted in an ocean fishery. So next slide, please. And this is a brief summary of the federal fishery disaster declarations for West Coast salmon and the troll fishery, at least. And the timeline going back to the first one that was associated with that warm year along the West Coast in 1983 with very poor catches in 84 and again 85. If you go through this list, what I want you to see is that it's a mixed bag of the kind of climate extremes that were implicated as contributing to the problem with particular fisheries. And in some cases, it's drought, and in other cases, flooding. In particular, Washington has a couple of years where flooding was a real concern. California stocks have typically been especially impacted by multi-year drought periods, but even some extreme single-year droughts. And then ocean conditions is the other that has been targeted as a real problem in many years in this list. And it has affected different stocks and populations in different years, which has led to closures along different parts of the coast. Next slide, please. So altogether, there's been this changing context, both in the climate and in the way the fisheries are managed, that has multiple dimensions. And one of those key dimensions is the warming climate and an era of frequent drought along the West Coast. And since the 1970s, there just have been more frequent droughts than what we had in the previous 40 years. And part of that might be natural variability, and it's also clear that that's being exacerbated by the longer term warming trends that, especially this recent California drought, came with record high surface temperatures over land in 2014, 2015, and 2016. And that had made the drought conditions substantially worse than it would have been under more normal or more typical temperature conditions. There's been an increased frequency of ocean temperature extremes along the West Coast. That time series that Mike showed for the California current system annual temperature shows that we really only had one of these big multi-year warm events prior to the 1980s, going back to the 20s at least. That was in the 1957 to sort of 1960 period. And now we've had the 82, 83 extreme with the El Nino, 97, 98, a series of warm years in the early 90s, and then this most recent ocean heat wave in 2014 to 2016. Back on land, though, the evolution of the salmon production system has also been a contributing factor. In California, for example, there's been increasing hatchery contributions to the total production, and a growing reliance on off-site releases of large smolts. There's evidence for increasing synchrony among the populations that are just making it a more volatile system. And some thought that this is making it more sensitive to the variable ocean conditions and drought conditions that have been happening. And then out in the marine environment, there have been evolving marine food webs there as well. And some of this also relates back to policies from the 1970s. Increases in top predators like whales, sea lions, and harbor seals can be traced back to the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We have increasing abundances of some seabirds and growing seabird colonies. The top end of the food web, and at the bottom end of the food web, lots of variability in key forage fish, for instance, the boom and bust cycles of California sardines and northern anchovy. Next slide, please. So in summary, trying to wrap up this whole package that we've put together for today, on the physical side, we're entering an era of rapid ocean change. The high frequency of extreme warm events along the West Coast and the California current system since the 1980s has caused widespread ecosystem and fishery impacts. Climate models predict that ocean extremes are going to become more frequent and more intense as the warming trends accelerate. So this is going to make things harder to manage. There's really no getting around this future that we're facing right now with the projections that we have, and the ecosystem responses to future climate change. In the next decade or two, the slower trends that are driven by the buildup of greenhouse gases may be hard to detect in the presence of the large year-to-year variations that really characterize the historical record along the West Coast. We should expect to continue to see large year-to-year variations on top of this slower increasing trend of warming and acidification and declines in dissolved oxygen. But those trends are projected to accelerate as we go forward in time. And for chronic climate sensitive fishery challenges like those managing West Coast salmon, they're likely to become even more frequent and intense. And I think of West Coast Chinook salmon as being poster child for this. And what it suggests is if we can't take other actions to make these populations less sensitive and make them more resilient to environmental variations, it just doesn't bode well for a robust fishery going into the future. And finally, that we are looking at a no analog future in terms of the physical and chemical state of the ocean. And as we move deeper into these ocean states without historical analogs, we should expect that we're going to have novel and surprising ecosystem impacts and fishery management challenges. And the story around the whale entanglement in 2015, 2016 is, I think, a pretty interesting example of how complicated that might be, where you have an unprecedented harmful algal bloom coming with changes in the distribution of top predators like whales and the availability of different forage species that then combines with a fishery management response to a domoic acid contamination issue that has never happened before, to lead to that kind of incident. So with that, I'll stop and we'll take time for questions.
Thank you both. That was really an excellent presentation. This is Yvonne. And I know Richard Scully from the Ecosystem Work Group has been rapporteuring, and we'll start with taking questions from the work group. But I just first wanted to really thank you guys for putting so much work into giving us a great big picture overview. You know, Nate, that was pessimistic there at the end, but it's good to know what we're up against. So really appreciate all of the work that went into this. This was a great kickoff to the webinar series. One of my questions that occurred as I went along, and then Richard, I'll let you jump in, was in Michael's portion of the presentation. Mike, you had mentioned, let's see, some species being more summer sensitive. I think it was to upwelling changes, and some more winter sensitive to upwelling changes. And I was wondering if either you know whether the science centers have done any work sort of looking at that information crossed with the work that's been done on the climate vulnerability assessments, or how and whether those might work together, if they do at all.
Yeah, I'm actually going to let Stephen Bograd chime in on that one.
Yeah, Yvonne, that's a really good question. So that came from a study that actually Brian Black led, where, for example, if you look at something like rockfish, he was finding that when you had an earlier start to the upwelling season, you had better growth, and the implication was that perhaps they just had a longer growing season. And so the key point there is that some species seem to be very sensitive to the timing or the duration of upwelling and not just the intensity. The point about the climate vulnerability assessment, I think that's a very good one. That was one of the considerations when we looked at changes in upwelling. We were looking not just at changes in intensity and potentially bottom-up changes through primary production, but also these phenological changes and changes in seasonality, which actually might be an even larger impact for some of these species that are sensitive to that. So, yeah, it is one of the things that we're considering within the CVAs.
Great, thank you. Richard, did you want to jump in and start off the ecosystem work group questions? And then members of the public who are listening will move on to your questions once we get some work group questions rolling.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Richard Scully, and I was particularly, well, I'm interested in everything in here, but something that really gets my attention is the West Coast Chinook salmon. And being from Idaho, that's our main nexus to the Pacific fishery ecosystem, but not only all the changes that are occurring in the ocean with temperature and the things that follow up from temperature with the pH and oxygen, etc. But a lot of times there's questions of what's causing the decline in salmon, and of course from the headwaters we're concerned about the migration corridor, etc. But it's obvious in recent years all the problems that are occurring in the ocean, including the pinnipeds reaching carrying capacity and their effect on salmon. What do you think are the you see a lot of variability, extreme variability, but is there any range here for optimism on what kind of management or maybe that's going beyond what you're presenting as management? I'm just trying to figure out what to expect in the next decade or so on Chinook salmon and what kind of management can occur to try to ameliorate the problems.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that we might take from this run of years, 2014, 15, 16, is that in some respects it does give us a preview for how extreme the climate is expected to become later this century. And just in terms of the temperature change alone, the kind of temperatures that were observed in those years are projected to be probably much more common, much more like the new average temperature when we get into something like the 2060s or the 2080s, depending on how fast climate changes, which depends on lots of things. So what have we learned from that? What kind of vulnerabilities do our different salmon populations have to warm extremes, in either the migration corridor in their spawning or rearing habitat, or out in the ocean, that we might have some handle on, whether it is in terms of changing water management practices or habitat restoration actions that can, what I think of as make space for climate warming. And I know here in California, there's lots of discussion about opening up historic floodplains that are now farmed fields, where it's clear that when juvenile salmon get there, they grow at very high rates, and they can get big enough that their odds of surviving out in the ocean increase substantially just from being a lot more robust fish. We can also just look at the water management practices that have a dominant influence on how much water and at what time and even in what temperature it goes down, cannot be tuned to better serve ecosystem needs or particular salmon population needs. And I know it's not a problem in Idaho. You have lots of high quality, high elevation cold water habitat, but in other systems, a lot of that habitat is behind high dams that have no fish passage. And there's more work going on now to try and get fish into those habitats that should at least be more resilient in terms of their temperature sensitivity in a warming climate. But of course, there's lots of challenges there as well in terms of how do we get the fish up there and back in a way that they're still resilient and doesn't break the bank, because in some cases, the dam removal options are really not being considered. They're not politically likely to happen anytime soon. So there's trap and haul options that are being explored. And some of those are actually underway in the Northwest, and they will be underway in California pretty soon for some populations. At least that's the plan. And of course, there's hatchery practices and harvest policies, which we have direct control over, and many reports have gone into detail about what kind of hatchery reforms can make these populations more resilient. But there could also be some new look at trying to focus on climate resilient strategies for hatchery reform, which I don't think has received a whole lot of attention.
Thank you. I guess I should let other people delve into other aspects of this, but maybe one last question, if this is on the minds of the people in the science centers, is the Chinook salmon, whether they're hatchery or wild, go to different parts of the ocean, and I wonder if there's some areas that are less where fish may, or for salmon may mature, that are less hostile or less likely to be than others, and if trying to protect those spawning and rearing areas of those fish might be sort of a long-term survival scenario for the stocks. I'm not sure, and also if there's any consideration for the ability of wild versus hatchery, if there's any difference as far as their ability to cope with the changing environment, to be able to adapt. Thank you.
Yeah, those are really good questions. I don't have good answers for that. It might be other people working on salmon that can give you responses, but I'm going to hold off on that because I don't have a good response for you on those questions.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks, Nate. Does anyone else on the work group have any questions?
Yvonne, this is Corey. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
I'll get in the queue if no one else has one. And hi, and thanks everyone. That was a really interesting presentation. This is Corey Niles with WFW. I was kind of curious about like what we, the fisheries management community, can expect from you guys, the research community, next. Like where will you be spending your efforts? You kind of have said a couple times that short-term forecasts are pretty tough, and are you giving up on those? Are you working on better models, linking those to stock assessments? So yeah, where do you think you're pointing out some challenges we're looking at, but where are you guys going next to try to help with those?
Yeah, this is Mike. So the webinar next week is going to be, I think, entirely focused on what you're asking about. But just sort of in brief, we are putting a lot of effort into sort of projecting and predicting along the West Coast. And I guess I didn't mean to offer too bleak of a view in the short term. In reality, I would say that there is some predictive skill on the scale of months, say out to about a year. And a lot of that comes from either persistence, which is just where the way things are, they tend to stay that way. So if we have really warm water, for some period of time, it's going to stay warm before it goes back to normal. So there's some predictive capability just from that, but also things like El Nino and La Nina events that you can see developing along the equator, they have predictable impacts on the West Coast. So we have models that we're running and we're developing, and we'll be spending a lot of effort on in the next few years to get those predictions going. And then the other big effort is the climate projection. So now you're looking out maybe 50 to 100 years. And in that case, you're going far enough out into the future where this long-term trend is big enough that you can see it above the noise. So the part I guess was saying is a little bit bleak in terms of the predictions is the middle ground there. If you're looking at something like 5 to 10 years out, the variability is going to be dominated by this natural signal that is kind of too far out to be predictable. So most of the efforts, there's no predictability there. There's some, some hope there, but the larger signals seem to be on the scale of up to about a year and then beyond a few decades. And again, next week we'll talk a lot about that.
Yeah, the other thing I would...
Nate. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, the other thing I was going to mention...
This is Nate, and I was just going to say that on the fishery prediction end of the spectrum for preseason run size forecasts that inform the salmon planning, there is continued interest in trying to bring the environmental conditions and other ecosystem factors into those models to try and account for all these changes that are happening that we see, and also those that we're trying to predict with physical models going forward for the next few months or year or so. But it's been difficult, right? And you probably are aware that it's been really hard to come up with robust prediction methods that are incorporating different ecosystem indicators or environmental factors for those preseason run forecasts. They've probably had maybe more success off the Northwest than we've had in California so far. But we actually have a lot of people here in Santa Cruz developing different types of models, looking at data in new ways to try and advance that work as well. So, you know, my first reaction to your question was, we're working on everything to some degree or another. Hopefully there'll be progress in lots of these important areas.
Yeah, I was just going to mention again the climate vulnerability assessment that I believe Yvonne mentioned, and this is an effort that we're doing jointly on the West Coast between the Southwest and Northwest Fishery Science Centers, where we're looking at the life history attributes of various species and their distributions, and trying to at least speculate on which species are more vulnerable or more resilient to anticipated climate change, and then potentially which fishing communities might be more vulnerable as well. So that's something that's in progress that we're trying to complete, and I believe it's going to be discussed to some extent in, I think, maybe the third webinar in this series.
And this is Therese Schmidt with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I had a question kind of related to that, but are we collecting, I guess, the sufficient types of information for describing these anomalous events and being able to capture them for predictions for the future? I guess I'm just wondering if there are gaps that you've identified that you really would like to know about, but we don't have some data collection effort underway now.
Yeah, I don't know. And I think it's better as you get, it's better the more physical you are, and then as you go up and more into the biology, the sampling is more and more sparse. Speaking for the physical side, you know, satellites, as long as they're flying, are sort of the best probably observing asset we have. The disadvantage to them being that they can only see the surface of the ocean. But there are some things like these underwater gliders that are autonomous vehicles that run transects off the West Coast in a few locations, mostly in, well, a few in Southern California, Central California, and then I think one off Oregon and one off Washington, that actually can map the vertical structure of at least the temperature and salinity. So on the physical climate, I think we were able to map the recent few years pretty well. I'm less in a position to speak to the sort of higher trophic levels and fishery impacts.
Certainly for salmon, we would love to have more information about how they move through their habitats in freshwater estuaries, and especially the nearshore ocean, where there's good evidence that a lot of the variation in year class strength is set in terms of the early marine survival and early marine growth. You know, where are those fish going? What is happening to them in the good years versus the bad years in terms of their survival and abundance? And is there something we can do on the management side to improve their chances for experiencing high survival rates? And, you know, there are tag developments that are going on in terms of tracking these fish, and the number of things going on here in California. The Columbia Basin has a history of doing this kind of work, but once they get out into the ocean, it's harder and harder to understand and to keep track of them. And, you know, we're hopeful and looking at new platforms for trying to do ocean research that puts those fish in the context of the habitat that they're in that helps determine how well they do. So I think those are some of the big data gaps that we're concerned about for salmon here in California and up in the Northwest as well.
Yeah, and I'll just a couple more that just came up here, or another key one is sort of the trophic link between the phytoplankton, which are pretty well observed by satellites, and well, basically zooplankton and forage fish that kind of link phytoplankton to higher trophic levels. We have some survey data, but that's really it. We don't have sort of a spatially and temporally resolved data set. So a lot of the time you're trying to come up with relationships between some fish or other animal of interest and the physics, when really, you know, that relationship has to be a proxy for something that you're not properly observing.
Well, thanks very much. And I echo Yvonne and everybody else's compliments. This was really excellent. Thanks for doing it. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is Deb Wilson-Dannenberg with the work group from Cal Fish and Wildlife. I had two questions. One was, you talked about, I think it was Mike, talked about the strongest El Nino on record right after we had the blob develop. And my question is, was that a cause or an effect, do you think?
No. Yeah, that's why I say, you know, you can look at records of these types of events, and there's some, actually Nate can speak to some indication of different climate events being more strongly coupled under climate change. But I think that this was largely, you know, part of the reason this was such a big event was that some of these natural things, that natural forcings that you might have one or two of them in play at any given time, they were sort of all three there for a couple of years, and sort of pushed this really big response.
Yeah, I'm fine with that answer.
Thanks. I have one other question, and I think this was, oh no, Nate, maybe Nate, this was you also. I got the impression that I almost thought where I heard part of the discussion going was, were we looking at maybe not an alternate stable state, but was it that with the increase in frequency and intensities, are we looking at some sort of alternate stable state, or are we just looking at some continuous process where they just keep getting more and more frequent and more intense? Maybe that's answering my own question. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know, I think on the physical side, you can think of this as there's two pieces really. In one piece, there is this slow trend that is tracking the relatively slow, you know, at least in the human lifetime, the context for climate change is pretty slow, that greenhouse gases accumulate at a rate of something like 1% per year, and the climate change global average temperature, for instance, has this relatively steady, slow increase. And it's especially evident if you look at the heat contained in the ocean. Actually, surface air temperatures do have quite a bit of year-to-year variation when you compare it to where most of this excess heat is going, which is the upper ocean. And that is a lot more steady accumulation of heat. When you drill down to a particular location on the map, like the California current system, then you see that, wait a minute, this is not very steady and stable. This is varying a lot from one year to the next. And it's only when you compute a long-term trend, say from 1900 to present, that you see there is a trend that is underlying these large year-to-year or even decade-to-decade fluctuations. So the climate, I would say that, you know, the odds are that it's much more in transition than moving between different stable states. Ecosystems, being a lot sort of more dynamic and interactive with many moving parts, they can go through multiple stable states. And some of the best examples are coral reefs that can become dominated by algae, or kelp forests that can be overrun with urchins that become urchin barrens. Then there's feedbacks that can maintain these persistent stable states, even though the physical environment might be changing a lot. And that's where I would say that, you know, the different stable states we might see, things go from a big jump from one to another. Our kelp forests on the North Coast in California are one example right now where we're in this urchin barren state with big declines in kelp and problems for abalone and really high densities of urchins. And I think there's a question, you know, can that flip back to one where the urchins are much less abundant and dense and the kelp forest recovers and some of the grazers come back in abundance like abalone? So does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. That was really helpful. It helped too because it made me remember my third question, which was that I know through time we've seen lots of variability in anchovy abundance. And so what really was it about the incidents the last few years where we did have more impacts with whales that caused that to happen that would have been different than other times when we had large numbers of anchovies? Is it that they were just crowded against the coast because of the water conditions, or something else?
I think that's a big part of it, that in past periods of high abundance of anchovies, a lot of times they're spread out over a broad part of the shelf instead of crowded up into smaller areas. The other parts in that list that we had, you know, that led to the whale entanglement was having lots of crab gear there late in the season, when a lot of those fishermen in a typical year would be targeting Chinook salmon, or at least in the 70s or 80s or even the 90s. And then, then just that relates back to the harmful algal bloom, which was unprecedented in the domoic acid contamination of crab. So there were a number of unusual things happening. And then one that I didn't sort of link in there is that there are more humpback whales along the West Coast now than there were in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s and the 40s. You know, that their abundances have increased substantially.
Thanks for that, and thanks to both of you for some excellent presentations.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make another comment on, I guess, your previous question about, you know, different stable states. And I think that's really going to be a key emphasis of research in the science centers coming up is, can we identify tipping points where we would see a different ecosystem state? For example, if pH gets below some threshold, will we see a change in community composition and things like that? So it's a very tough question to get at, but I think it's one that we're going to be thinking more about in the coming years.
Thanks.
Okay, does anyone else from the work group have any questions? And if not, Kit, I would turn this over to you so you could manage the hand raising that and muting and unmuting process.
Okay, we'll stand by and see if hands come up. Okay, Doug Fricke, you had your hand raised. Go ahead. Are you there, Doug? Go ahead if you have something to say.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry to give. This is Doug Fricke. I'm on the HMS Advisory Sub-Panel, and also an active salmon fisherman, so quite interested. I'm not sure which gentleman it was, but interesting presentation. I sat through a similar presentation a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, from a doctor up at the University of Washington, and they said that when these ocean temperature raises, or, and as the temperature goes up and down, particularly in the phytoplankton. I think they said the cichlids as well. Some animals do better than others, and some go down, some go up. I wondered if you guys had looked at the alternatives that might be feed for the various animals in the ocean if the temperature does go up. And then the second question, and then I'll stop, is you've been looking over 100 years for this same presentation. The person went back like centuries and said that the Earth has a history of up and down. Did you guys do any evaluation of where we might get a change in the in this general cycle that we've identified with the heating of the ocean? Did I lose you?
No, we're here. So certainly the first part of that question, yeah, there are winners and losers. So in that impacts of the recent years, there are, species that had their range, the range of habitable ocean greatly increased. And from the human perspective, that could be for a fisherman, that could be a great new opportunity to fish some species that you wouldn't be able to locally. So a lot of these things, I think, it's change, and whether it's good or bad is a little bit dependent on your perspective. If you think generally that, a lot of fish like to have some thermal envelope, some range of temperatures that they like, then those are going to generally go farther north. So, if you think of federal fisheries, then things that are fished off the Washington coast might go into Canadian waters, but things that are fished off Baja California might come into U.S. waters. So yeah, there's certainly winners and losers within the ecosystem and in the human realm. The second question, so for a lot of these questions, so on the biological side, we're much more data limited when we go back even a couple decades, let alone centuries or millennia. And, for a lot of us, I think on the timescales of fisheries management, those aren't as relevant. There are important science questions there, but most of our focus is on, the historical record where we have good fishing data, looking out to maybe up to 100 is our focus.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the physical variabilities, like the warming that you mentioned, there's definitely been lots of ups and downs in Earth history. I think what we're seeing now, what makes it, special or unprecedented is the rate of change, and what the climate models are anticipating the rate of change to be is very high. So I think that's kind of a unique situation here.
Doug, do you have another question? Or are you done?
Can you hear me now, Kit?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. No, that answers my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Richard, we see you raised your hand. You're not muted, so if you want to go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I read a report recently. It was by one of the presenters. I think from next week is going to be. He will talk about. Well, he will have talked about the marine pinnipeds and whales that have increased and are now taking more Chinook salmon than the fishing fleet, and over time how that's changed. And I was just reading that and listening to what you said made me wonder about if Chinook salmon are going to likely have a more likely difficult life in the ocean as these temperatures on average get warmer and warmer. Is there any are people beginning to think about management of the pinnipeds? I believe I saw where 70,000 or 60,000 or so harbor seals in the Saley Sea have a huge impact on Chinook smolts, and then of course adult pinnipeds have an effect on returning spring Chinook in the Columbia. So, but anyway, I guess so. My question is it time for some new and innovative management to try to deal with or acknowledge that the situation is changing, and maybe we need to have some management changes to go along with that?
Yeah, you're probably talking to the wrong people for that question. Although, in the science centers, the study that you mentioned that was done in part by people at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center to pull the data together for marine mammal consumption at different parts of the coast through time and space for the sort of different species, to try and come up with some estimates about what kind of impacts these changes in abundance are having on Chinook salmon. So if people bring in different management scenarios, they can be evaluated through the same kind of analysis where you go through the whole list of supply and demand of what they need and what they might consume from the salmon resource. So certainly the science work can be done, and there's a foundation for going forward for that.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Kip Dahl with council staff, and I actually had a question, and that has to do an issue. It's one of the Magnuson Act national standards. We don't actually think about it as often as perhaps we should, but that is safety of life at sea, and maybe more generally just sort of thinking about the way that fisheries operate. And so in that context, I was just curious if any of these projections, climate modeling, have any capacity to sort of look at those sea state conditions. And so in short, more severe storms, rougher seas, more frequent, or things like that. Is there any forecasting of that nature?
Yeah, there definitely is. That the science has developed pretty well at looking at the statistics of storms and also how that translates to changes in the statistics of wave heights. And I know that work exists, but I don't actually know off the top of my head what the projections show.
Okay, do we have any more questions from anyone in the public or in the work group? And if not, Kit, would you mind wrapping us up and giving us a little information about the day and time of the next webinar?
Well, this is Corey. I'll have another one. If no one else has one, I have another question, but...
Thank you. Go ahead.
Kit launches. And does anyone else have a question? Well, I'll just ask it since I have the mic. And you'll know that I'm not an oceanographer by me asking this question. But I think up here, and again, this is Corey Niles from WFW, and the northern part of the California current, including Vancouver Island, I think I've read that the primary productivity is not so much based. It's at the height of the summer, it's highly productive, but it's not necessarily because of winds upwelling, but upwelling from other things, the canyons and the outflow from the Strait of Juan de Fuca, et cetera. Do the models show changes at that level or in that dynamic happening, or would that be captured in the primary productivity forecast you were showing?
So things like canyons, which are important conduits for nutrients in certain places, would not be resolved just in those climate models. Even freshwater inputs, I think you'd be hard pressed to resolve just because you're on the scale, of 100 kilometers or more. The dynamics that I was sort of laying out for the California current are dominant along a lot of the coast, but absolutely in areas, near the mouth of the Columbia River as well, the Pacific Northwest, much more so than the California coast. These freshwater inputs are very important. So that would be something that can be resolved in some of these regional models that won't be resolved in global models. And again, that'll be something that's talked about next week. But you can take information from the course resolution global models, like if there's an increase in rainfall, say, and you can use that information to run smaller areas at higher resolution to see then what the impacts of those broader scale changes are on the fine scales on individual rivers and things like that.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Kit again. We're not seeing any more people wanting to ask a question, so I guess we'll wrap up this webinar. I'll just join others in expressing appreciation to the presenters for taking the time to put together this presentation and give it, and spending time answering people's questions. So just as Yvonne requested, we do have up here, you should be able to see on your screen the schedule of the upcoming webinars. The next one is a week from today, February 1st, and starts at the same time, 1:30. And the title of that presentation is The State of the Art for Ecological Forecasting in the Short, Medium, and Long-Term Timeframes. So we have very good participation today, and I look forward to seeing everybody joining us again in a week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kit, and thanks to our speakers again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.